Welcome to the video, everybody. My name is Luke McMillan and I'm the physical exercise specialist for Base Gagetown. Now I work under Krista Davidson. She's the reconditioning manager here on Base, and together as a team we help to rehab those who are struggling with chronic disease or injuries here on Base Gagetown. Now today we are discussing how to improve the lateral lunge. So stick around for the entirety of the video for a full explanation on how to do so. Today we're going to be discussing lateral lunge mechanics, progressions of the lateral lunge, as well as additional exercises that will help to improve the lateral lunge. Now, first of all, why is it important to lunge laterally or to the side? Why is it important to do so? Well, a lot of our training takes place in what we call the sagittal plane. Okay, we do a lot of forward and reverse lunges, and we do a lot of lower body movements that don't take place in the frontal plane, okay, in lateral direction. Okay, so it's very important to train in the frontal plane and train the lateral lunge, especially if you're an athlete and looking to improve athletic performance. It's not something that you should overlook. Now, before you go into working on your lateral lunge, you should have a good understanding of the foundational material that is important for safe lifting and safe movement in general. Okay, so if you haven't watched my neutral spine or my core exercises videos, you can click on the links there below in the description, and that'll give you a great foundation that you can actually apply to these movements today. Okay, it's important to keep in mind neutral spine when we load a lateral lunge. It's also important to keep in mind bracing, right, and breathing, and those core exercises will help give you a better understanding of how things should feel when you go into more dynamic movements like the lateral lunge like we're doing today. So before we get into specifics, I want you to think position, tension, and movement. Okay, position, tension, movement. Okay, so you're going to think to yourself, okay, am I positioned correctly? Do I have a neutral spine? Am I in a safe position? And then you're going to think tension. You're going to think bracing. Let's engage the musculature to ensure that I'm strong and sturdy and stable in this position. And then you're going to think movement. Okay, so don't get into that lateral lunge position and just think movement right away. Take your time, take a few breaths, think position, tension, and then movement, and we should be fine. All right, so let's dive into lateral lunge specifics in terms of technique. The lateral lunge isn't a very complicated exercise, and it doesn't actually take very long to teach to athletes or general population in my experience. However, it is an exercise that a lot of people struggle with, and that's why we're going to spend some time on technique. However, it's not going to take up a whole lot of the video, and then the rest of the time we're going to focus on progressive overload, how we can kind of progress these modifications of the lateral lunge, as well as additional exercises if you're just not there yet, if you're not getting full range in your lateral lunge, or you need additional exercises to build strength in those positions. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll start to realize that a lot of the same principles will apply to these movements. Okay, so again, we're going to initially think position, tension, movement. We're going to keep in mind neutral spine, bracing, and breathing. And if you haven't been over that stuff yet, I suggest clicking on the links below and going over that with me in my other videos, okay, because it will apply today. We're also going to think about something called a tripod foot. Okay, so we don't want the weight on our heels. We don't want the weight forward. We want the weight nice and balanced and evenly distributed on our feet. Okay, think evenly distributed weight on our feet. Okay, a nice balanced gripped foot for the ground. Okay, so we can also talk about creating torque and a bunch of these other things, but I went over all of that in my neutral spine and bracing video. So if you haven't checked it out, just check that out, and you'll go over the foundations and the basics that you can really apply to this lateral lunge today. So we're going to start in this position here, and the very first thing we're going to go over is the fact that I should be nice and squared. Okay, my feet are facing forward, my hips are facing forward, my shoulders forward, my head forward. Chin is just slightly tucked, okay, it's not pushed out like this, slightly tucked here. Okay, so if you guys see from the side, I'm starting in this position. Everything is nice and squared, and chin is nice and tucked, and my cervical spine is healthy. So what am I going to think before even attempting this lateral lunge? Position, tension, movement. Well, right here, I've got pretty good position, okay? I've got a neutral spine, slightly lordotic lower back curve, slightly kyphotic up top, and a nice healthy C-spine. And I'm going to think tension next. Position, tension. I'm going to think about bracing, okay? If you haven't gone over that, go to the other video. But I'm going to think about creating intra-abdominal pressure, rib cage down and out. I've got tension here, I've got tension here. I'm going to think about creating torque in my feet, engaging my glutes, okay? And just being prepared for movement, especially if this was a loaded movement, okay? But it's just body weight, but we're going to act like it is loaded because in the future you might be there, right? So then we can think about moving and actually going through the lateral lunge. Now, what do you want to keep in mind before you actually go down? Well, we want to keep this knee over those toes, okay? That's the key here, okay? I want to keep the knee right in line with that foot there, okay? I don't want it way off to the side where I'm losing balance in my foot. I don't want it inside like this where I'm increasing that Q line on my knee there. And the other leg just stays nice and straight. Okay, does that make sense? So I'm going down. I'm just going to start to push the hips backwards, okay? And you're going to be creating a little bit of a hinge movement, right, at the hips here while you go down, okay? We've got a nice big chest, but we're creating a little bit of a hinge movement. I'm bending forward just slightly, shooting those hips backwards towards the wall. My knee is staying in line with my toes here, and when I get to my bottom range, I can power up. And you notice that my other leg just stayed nice and straight the entire time. It shouldn't be an uncomfortable stretch amongst your adductors there in that leg. So from the side, if I were to go into that, again, I'm going to think position. I'm going to square everything up. My toes are squared up to the wall, my hips, my shoulders, my head. Tuck the chin just slightly. I'm going to think tension. Create intra-abdominal pressure, engage the glutes, neutralize the pelvis, okay? Now I'm in a position where I can move. And again, before I start to move, I'm not going to just start bending the knee like this and stay super upright like that. You need to shoot those hips backwards to create a more natural hinge and squat pattern to this, okay? It is probably a little bit more squat than hinge, but there is definitely a hinge pattern to this lateral lunge, and you want to shoot those hips back so that it can be more functional, okay? So I'm going to think shoot the hips back, and my knee is right in line with my toes here, and when I get to my end range, this leg is completely straight. When I get to my end range, I can power up, okay? And we're bracing once again at the top. Now, depending on how wide you go, you may require just a little bit of external rotation, just very, very slight external rotation. What I mean by that is I don't want you to completely toe up off the ground there, but you may require just slight eversion in that foot to allow the head of the femur to sit a little bit nicer in the acetabulum there, depending on your physiological makeup. Okay, so you may require just slight external rotation here prior to going down into your eccentric phase of the lateral lunge. Now those are the basics, those are the foundations of learning the lateral lunge. So throughout the movement, what should you be thinking about? You should be thinking about keeping your body nice and squared, okay? So you see a lot of people, as they go down, they'll start to twist and do a lot of weird things like that with their spine, okay? But I want to think nice and squared the entire time, keep this leg nice and straight, brace, take a deep breath, and then we're going down into that lateral lunge, shoot those hips back, and power up, okay? So that's the static lateral lunge, and those are some of the proper mechanics of learning it. Some common faults that I see when people perform this is they'll start to flex at the spine when they require additional strength, like in the bottom of that phase there of the lateral lunge. So just remember, when you're going down in that lateral lunge, don't start to cave when you require more strength to get up. Keep that chest a little bit higher. We don't need to be excessively extended through the spine, but we do want to be neutral, and we don't want to start to cave down when you're at the bottom of that lateral lunge. So keep that in mind while performing this. Another common fault I see is individuals not understanding that there is a hinge component to this lateral lunge. And I kind of addressed it there earlier, but just to reiterate here, there is a hinge pattern to this lateral lunge. And if you do not shoot those hips backwards, then you'll end up kind of just looking like this. And that knee will trail way over the toe line, which isn't a massive deal, but it's just not very functional. And you'll probably get some heels elevating and things like that. It doesn't feel like a very athletic position. So think, shoot the hips back, make sure you have that hinge pattern down, and then go into that squat, okay? And you'll feel much better, much safer at the bottom of that lateral lunge. Which brings me into my next point. Another common fault is when people do their lateral lunge, sometimes they think they need to go all the way down to the ground. Okay, so they will go down into their lateral lunge, and they'll be finishing in a position like this. Okay, I can't get into a perfect bottom lateral lunge position, but I think you guys understand what I'm talking about. They'll go all the way down to the bottom of that end range, and ultimately it's just not very functional, especially for general population and things like that. You just don't need to go that low. You'll get something called, hip winking. When we talk about a squat, there will be definitely some hip winking when you go that low in a lateral lunge. So the lower back will kind of wrap underneath of the movement, and that can ultimately lead to flexion of the lower back. It's just not a safe position for your lower back, okay? It can also lead to that knee trailing way off to one side or the other, which isn't healthy for that knee either. And there's no need for going that low, especially for general population, okay? So just go down into your end range of that lateral lunge and then power right back up, maintaining a neutral spine, brace position, and lots of tension as you do so. Let's get into progressions of the lateral lunge. Let's go over 3 main progressions to this lateral lunge so that you guys can better understand of maybe where you should start or where you should end up in a couple of months if you're training this lateral lunge properly. So the first progression of this lateral lunge is exactly what we were just doing when we were going over mechanics, okay? There's not a whole lot of movement, there's not a whole lot of complexity. We're already in a position to lunge and we just laterally lunge, okay? So that looks like we're looking for our position here, everything nice and squared, okay? We're keeping in mind all of our position, tension, movement rules that we talked about there earlier. We're gonna think about creating torque in our feet and bracing and breathing throughout this movement. We're going to shoot our hips back. We're going to keep the knees in line with the toes there. And we're going to keep a nice neutral spine. And then we're going to ride up. So that's the first progression of the lateral lunge. And if you don't have full range of motion strength, if you don't have strength through that entire range of motion, then you can always go maybe halfway and grind up, okay? Halfway and power up, just like that, okay? Work into it in phases, okay? Maybe go half lateral lunge and back up. Work on that hinge and back up, okay? Just like this. And then you might want to go full range of motion lateral lunge. Okay, so that's the very first progression is there's no movement. Your feet are just staying nice and sturdy here and they don't move, okay? You're just in this position and you laterally lunge, maybe 8 to 12 per side and then switch sides, okay? Going to the other leg. Now, the next progression would be a stepping lateral lunge, okay? So for this one, I'm starting with my feet. We'll get this dumbbell out of the way for now. I'm starting with my feet just like this, okay? Maybe hip width, maybe shoulder width, and then I'm going into a stepping movement. Okay, so just like if I was performing a forward lunge or something like that, I need to really, it's a lot more advanced because you're kind of halting your momentum, okay, laterally. So again, we're in this frontal plane here. I'm going to step out, and the very first thing I'm going to think about is step, stop, okay? Create stability in that position before just dropping down, okay? So I'm here. I'm thinking about position, tension, movement already. I'm nice and braced. I'm breathing. I'm in a good neutral position. I step, stop. I just hit that position. I create stability in this position, and then I go into my lateral lunge and power up. Now, when I power up, I'm going to ride right back up to that starting position. Okay, so that's the stepping lateral lunge. Remember, step, stop, and then you can step back. okay, after performing it. Once again, I'm in this position, I step, I stop, I create stability, I go into my lateral lunge, and then I power right back up to a brace position, okay, and really pull back up with that left leg as well, okay? You're powering with the right and pulling with the left kind of thing, depending on what leg you're lunging on. The next progression would be a dumbbell or a weighted lateral lunge. So for this one, I've gotten out a dumbbell here for us, and we're going to load this position now, okay? So again, this is definitely an advanced movement, and we're actually going to step as well, okay? So we're going to step and load this position. So much more advanced than just standing there and attempting the lateral lunge, okay? So very first thing, I've got my dumbbell in the opposite hand of what I'm stepping with, okay? And there's a few different ways you can do this. You can do a front racked kettlebell lateral lunge. You can do like sort of like a goblet lateral lunge as well and hold it up top here. But this is one that I like to go to for our next progression here. I think it's pretty useful for general population and athletes, okay? So we're gonna start in this position here. I'm going to hold this dumbbell with the opposite hand of the foot I'm stepping with, okay? So if I'm stepping with my right foot, I'm going to hold the dumbbell with my left hand. And I'm going to start in a nice hip to shoulder width position here. I'm going to step, stop. This dumbbell just kind of maintains this position right here in between my legs, and I'm not going to turn my shoulders one way or the other, right? I'm staying nice and squared. Then I can come down and power up, just like that. So you're thinking about the same things we talked about in that stepping lateral lunge. We're in our nice position to begin with. We step, stop, create stability before we drop down, because if you don't create stability, you're just going to kind of cave. You might go off too far laterally there when you try to drop down into that lunge, and it won't be controlled. Okay, so we're here, we step, stop, create stability, brace, big breath. Then we go into our lateral lunge, right? We power up and we slide over. Okay, so we're pulling with this leg and we're powering with that right. Does that make sense? So, and the dumbbell just stays nice and natural there, okay? Over time throughout the set, you don't want that dumbbell to continue to come forward. So keep the shoulder girdle nice and packed there so that you can maintain a safe T and C spine while you're performing this exercise. Now, let's get into additional exercises that you can do to help improve strength in your lateral lunge. The three main exercises we're going to go over, additional exercises to help improve your lateral lunge, are the goblet squat, a split squat, or a reverse lunge. Maybe we'll just go over the reverse lunge today, and then a kettlebell RDL. Okay, we're going to use a dumbbell today, but a Romanian deadlift, a hinged pattern. Okay, so those are the three exercises that we're going to go over today to help improve our lateral lunge. We're going to start with the goblet squat. Now, I do have a video on Facebook, on PSP Gagetown's Facebook page, going over squat mechanics, and that is most definitely a whole other video in itself. Okay, so it takes quite a bit of time to go over efficient squat mechanics, but we're not going to spend a ton of time on that. We're just talking about the lateral lunge today, but we are just going to bring up these exercises kind of briefly here so that you know what other exercises you can kind of program in to your routine to help with improving this lateral lunge. Okay, so the goblet squat, we want this dumbbell or a kettlebell nice and close to our body. Okay, it's kind of like front racked here. Okay, so that's the position that we want the weight to be in before going into our goblet squat. Very, very quickly, we're going to have our feet generally just over shoulder width, feet just slightly everted most of the time, okay? Depending on your anatomy, we're going to think a lot of the same things that we've thought in the past: position, tension, movement. So very, very first thing, I'm going to create torque in my feet. I'm going to fire out my glutes. I'm going to create intra-abdominal pressure, right? I'm going to make sure my shoulder girdle is nice and healthy here, and I've got a nice neutral spine. I'm going to take a deep breath in on the way down on the eccentric, and we're just going to go into a basic squat pattern, right? And then we power up and brace. Once again, the goblet squat just looks like this. Take a deep breath. After you brace, create tension. just like this, and power up and brace. Okay, so that's our goblet squat. We can load it with, once again, a dumbbell or a kettlebell, and that will really help with your squat strength. Okay, and there is a lot of strength associated with a squatting pattern when you're going about that lateral lunge. The next exercise I want to bring up is a reverse lunge. Okay, so this is an important exercise to be doing as well if you're trying to improve strength in your lateral lunge. Okay, you should definitely have this exercise down prior to participating in a lateral lunge. Okay, so if you don't have this reverse lunge down, I would definitely get this down prior to going into training that lateral lunge. So we're in a nice neutral position to start with, and again, you can load this with a couple of dumbbells or a front racked dumbbell or front racked kettlebell or whatever. And then we're going to step back, okay? And when I step back, I don't want to step directly behind that foot. Did you see what happened there? I tried to step directly behind this foot, and you can lose balance, okay? We're going to step back and allow a little bit of spacing between those feet there. Okay, so now I'm in a much more sturdy position. And it's very, very similar to stepping with that lateral lunge. We're going to step, stop, and then move. And again, we're thinking position, tension, movement. Position, tension, and now we can move. We're going to step back. We're going to stop, stabilize, okay? Nice safe position here. And then we're going to drop down, okay? At the bottom of this lateral lunge, I've got a nice natural lean forward to ensure that I have a neutral spine. I could usually draw a line up from this knee all the way up to the shoulder, depending on your anatomy. Okay, and then I'm going to power up and brace at the top. From the side, I'm in a nice neutral position to start with. Hopefully you guys can see me there on camera. I'm going to step back, not in line with this foot and get off balance. I'm going to just step back, hit that position, stabilize, and then from here, making sure that I've got a neutral spine throughout this movement, I'm going to drop. Okay, and again, at the bottom of this lunge position, I've got a nice natural lean forward to ensure that I have natural curves in my spine. Okay, my chest is lifted here, and then I can power up. And the knee is staying in line with the toes and right over top of the toes. Does that make sense? The third exercise, a kettlebell or a dumbbell Romanian deadlift or hinge pattern. Now, as you guys noticed earlier, the hinge pattern is definitely a big part of learning the lateral lunge. The squat pattern is very important as well, but you need to be able to hinge efficiently to laterally lunge, okay? So we can use a dumbbell for this, but if you haven't practiced your hinge pattern yet, I suggest just practicing without a weight. Sometimes you can use a dowel and hold the stick up like this and work into your hinge pattern like that. But hopefully, if you're watching this video and you're looking at improving your lateral lunge, you're a little bit more advanced. And I hope that you've at least heard that term before. If not, that's completely fine. But we're going to use a dumbbell to work on that hinge technique in our kettlebell or our dumbbell Romanian deadlift. Okay, so very, very quickly, again, we get to spend a ton of time on a hinge technique, but this is just an exercise that you can use additionally to help improve the lateral lunge. Check out another video about hinging to really dive into specifics because it is very complicated and you want to make sure that you're doing it properly, okay? But very quickly, we're going to take this dumbbell and make sure it's nice and close to our body. First thing I'm going to take care of is my shoulder girdle and we're not kind of caving here because what am I thinking to begin with? Position, tension, movement. So I'm going to think proper position. Shrug up, retract, depress the shoulder girdle. Dumbbell stays nice and close. I've got a slight bend in my knees here. I've got a tucked chin and a nice neutral spine. From there, I'm going to begin to hinge at the hips. So I'm going to push the hips back and I'm going to hinge forward. Okay, as I hinge forward, this dumbbell stays nice and close to my body and my shoulders are staying squared, my hips are staying squared, and I can go all the way down to your anatomy allows kind of thing. You're going to really feel this fire up your glutes and your hamstrings. Okay, so when you're in the bottom of this position, the dumbbell should be nice and close. Okay, I shouldn't be caved at the back like this. I should be nice and neutral here, and then I can power up. Okay, hinge and power up. brace at the top. Okay, so that hinge pattern, as you noticed, is pretty important in that lateral lunge. It looks very similar, right? If I'm stepping into that lateral lunge, that's the first thing that normally happens. The hips and the knees will move at the same time, but the hips kind of shoot back and I go into that hinge type pattern right away. So reach out to your fitness instructors or your reconditioning department there on base so that they can help guide you through these additional exercises, because again, they're complex exercises and we didn't go over them in depth today, but it is important to recognize their benefit when trying to improve the lateral lunge. Obviously, the best way to improve the lateral lunge will be to perform the lateral lunge in itself. However, a basic squat pattern, a basic lunge pattern, and a basic hinge pattern are foundational to a lateral lunge movement. So you need to have those basic foundations down prior to performing a lateral lunge in the frontal plane. Okay, so get your squat down, that goblet squat, get down a reverse lunge or a forward lunge, and then start to weight it, and then get down a hinge pattern in maybe a Romanian deadlift with a kettlebell or a dumbbell. Okay, let's wrap it up. I hope you learned a few things today about how to improve your lateral lunge. Again, as you saw today, it's not an overly complex movement. However, it is an exercise that a lot of people struggle with because it's tough. It's a tough exercise, and we often don't train in that frontal plane. So it's tough. It's difficult to maintain strength in an end range of a lateral lunge, especially when you don't train there a whole lot. But it is foundational for athletic performance. Okay, so remember to throw in some frontal plane exercises so that you can increase your performance over time. Now, quick review. We started this video by going over the foundations, and it's very important to review foundational material prior to going into more complex movements like a lateral lunge. Okay, so what did we go over initially? We talked about position. Okay, so it's very important to think about your position before beginning any type of movement. Okay, so we talked about neutral spine, ensuring that we've got a nice lordotic curve, nice natural kyphotic curve up top. And if you don't know much about neutral spine, then go watch my neutral spine video, again, link in the description. And then the next thing we talked about was tension. Okay, so this is where we dove into bracing, creating torque in our feet, engaging the glutes, creating intra-abdominal pressure, ensuring we have a safe, packed shoulder girdle. And then we can think, and only then, we can think movement, okay? Then we can think, if we're performing a stepping lateral lunge, okay, we're in position, we're nice and tense and braced, we're ready to breathe here, we can step out and perform that lateral lunge. Remember, here, we want to take a deep breath in on the eccentric phase, on the downward face of that lateral lunge, and then a deep breath out on the concentric phase, or the upward phase of that lateral lunge. Okay, so very important to keep that in mind. A deep breath in on the eccentric, deep breath out on the concentric. Okay, so position, tension, movement. That's what we reviewed first. Then I began to go over some proper movement patterns for that lateral lunge, and I brought up some common faults that I often see with the general population when they're trying to work on or perform a lateral lunge. We talked about keeping that one leg nice and straight and keeping the other leg, the knee, right over top of the toes, not to the outside and not to the inside. We talked about how some people require maybe slight external rotation in that straightened leg depending on your anatomy. We also talked about common faults like a flexed spine, or not understanding a proper hinge pattern, or not stepping and stopping before creating movement. Okay, these are all things we talked about when we were going over proper movement patterns for the lateral lunge. We then brought up specifics in terms of progression, how to progress your lateral lunge, because not everyone has the same capacity right now, so you may begin at the very first progression that we talked about today, which was just basically a standing position and working on creating some range in that lateral lunge. And again, I talked about how you can start with a quarter lateral lunge or a half lateral lunge before getting into that full range. Okay, so again, that's not with the step. Then we talked about full range of motion lateral lunges, we talked about stepping lateral lunges, and then we talked about weighting it with a dumbbell. And again, there's several different ways that you can weight a lateral lunge, but that's the way that I chose today. And lastly, we reviewed those 3 crucial exercises that you need to have down, I think, prior to trying to improve that lateral lunge, the goblet squat, a reverse lunge or a forward lunge, and a RDL or a Romanian deadlift hinge pattern. So with all of that being said, thank you so much for joining me. Again, my name is Luke McMillan, and I'm the physical exercise specialist here for Base Gagetown. Again, I work with injuries and chronic disease here on base. I hope you've learned a few things today, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again.